The arguments for and against abortion are often very controversial, and rightfully so. Most who hold a pro abortion position don't necessarily take it lightly. They view it as a hard decision for any woman to make. But the problem with many arguments defending abortion is that they are not grounded in science and logic, but rather grounded in emotion. Consider this interview The Atlantic did with a young woman who grew up in a pro life home and has since switched positions. When asked about her views on abortion now, she describes this pro choice event that she went to, and she says it like this. She says, Cecile Richards, the previous president of Planned Parenthood, was there. It was a formative moment for me. Here we are, different faithful people of different creeds coming together to say bodily autonomy and reproductive rights are justice issues. That was a tipping point for me. I believe reproductive rights and bodily autonomy are deeply important. I believe in access to safe and legal abortions. I believe that the person who can make these decisions, or can best make these decisions, is the person who's considering these decisions. I believe every person I encounter, including myself, has the right to their body. Now, this woman makes a very logical argument. Of course, everyone has a right to their own body. Of course, bodily autonomy is a valid right, and the government should stay out of what I do with my body. I don't want the government telling me what to do with my own body. And this is a great argument for abortion. It's a very logical one. If the unborn baby that we're considering here is not a person. And I would argue that this is the most important issue at stake in this argument. Is the unborn baby a person? Because if it is a person, it's deserving of protection, especially given how vulnerable the child in the womb is. Now, what I want to show today in this argument is the scientific and logical reasoning behind the personhood of the unborn and why it shapes the abortion argument. So the first argument that I want to look at is this argument of, well, the unborn is not a human person. And in order to first address this, we need to define our terms. We need to break that claim down. The first question we need to ask is the unborn human? Now, this is actually not very controversial. Most pro-choice advocates would say that the unborn is of the human species. Consider this quote from Dr. Maureen Condition's white paper where she makes the argument, where does human life begin? I'll read her quote. She says, if the embryo comes into existence at the sperm-egg fusion, a human organism is fully present from the beginning, controlling and directing all of the developmental events that occur throughout life. This view of the embryo is objective, based on the universally accepted scientific method of distinguishing different cell types from each other, and it is consistent with the factual evidence. It is entirely independent of any specific ethical, moral, political, or religious view of human life or human embryos. Indeed, this definition does not directly address the central ethical questions surrounding the embryo. What value ought society to place on human life at the earliest stages of development? Does the embryo possess the same right to life as do human beings at later developmental stages? A neural examination of the factual evidence merely establishes the onset of a new human life at a scientifically well-defined moment of conception, a conclusion that unequivocally indicates that human embryos from the zygote stage forward are indeed living individuals of the human species, human beings. So we could look more at scientific conclusions here, but the general agreement is at conception, a human species, a human life is present. And this might seem to some like enough evidence to say, okay, that's human life, let's protect that human life from the point of conception. But this argument gets extended. This is the argument for the human species, which many accept, but the question now turns to, okay, but is it a person? And take a second to ask yourself, what is a person? In his article entitled, When Does It Become a Person?, Dr. Greg Henriquez of JMU, a professor at James Madison University, makes the case against the personhood of the fetus. And I want to spend some time kind of breaking down his argument and looking at how we can logically and scientifically reason that these points for denying the personhood of the fetus are not valid. So, Henriquez concludes in this article that human life begins at conception. He says that. He accepts the humanness, human nature of the fetus, as any rational academic would, but he argues against the personhood and the protection of the unborn. He says that the argument does not end at life, beginning at conception, because, as I'm going to quote him, he says, because an entity that is technically living and has human DNA is not equivalent to an entity that we should consider a person with all rights, moral values, and protections therein. He uses this example of scratching his arm and thousands of skin cells fall off, and he asks, okay, are those human cells, they're certainly human, are they worthy of protection? Am I committing mass murder by scratching my arm? So, what does he conclude that makes a human a person? What definition does he give? Well, he says a human, not a human person, but a human person has self-reflective awareness, a sense of self, and awareness of right and wrong. So using this definition, he says it's clear that a zygote, a child at the very, very early stages of development, is not a person. It doesn't possess these qualities. And this is where I think Henriquez's argument gets very interesting, and the flaw is glaringly obvious. He asks this question: so, according to logic, should we consider newborns persons in the legal sense? He says, yes, newborns are persons. And the reason is that their status, as such, is a function of their expected developmental emergence. In other words, we should consider them developing persons worthy of full rights and protection. And then he goes on to argue that because of this, abortion should always be allowed in the first trimester. There's kind of a gray area he talks about in the second trimester, not exactly sure. And by the third, there is limited justification for abortion. You have to have a really good reason if you need an abortion that late, is what he says. And he concludes with this. He says, the bottom line here is that just because human life scientifically starts at conception, it does not mean that the legal and moral status of personhood should also start at conception. So, how do we go about responding to an argument like Henriquez puts forward here? Well, first of all, the argument of human skin cells that flake off when you scratch your arm shows a basic, maybe misunderstanding of conception, or maybe just a denial of the science of conception. Now, certainly, if those flaked off arm cells were human beings that implanted in the ground or wherever they landed and grew and developed, then I would argue, yes, certainly they would be worthy of protection. But a cell flaked off your arm, even a cell that comes off another like vital organ, although human in nature, is not a human being. So I think that argument is a little bit of a red herring to take us away from the real questions that are being asked. Now, let's look at his main argument. His main argument of what makes a person a person. Once again, he says what makes a human a person is ability to self-reflect, an awareness of right and wrong, and a sense of self. He also claims that some level of development also makes one a person, but he doesn't really define this level of development. Now, you'll see many arguments around this topic and categories given, but I want to take a second to look at an argument that Stephen Schwarz helps break down into an acronym that I think is really helpful for us to think through these issues. And he uses the acronym SLED, S-L-E-D. He talks through size, through level of development, through environment, and through degree of dependency. All these are used as reasons to deny the personhood of a fetus. The pro-abortion side uses them to make a fetus not a person, and we'll spend some time explaining why these aren't logical reasons to deny the personhood of the unborn. The first is size. It's often claimed that the zygote or the fetus is not a person because of how small it is. And this is true. The fetus is very small at earlier stages of development. In fact, my wife is pregnant right now, and she has the app on her phone that says, "Oh, how big is the baby on any given week?" Our baby's a zucchini this week, so very small. Certainly, this is true. The child in the womb is smaller than we are. But if this holds true as a measure of personhood, then it would hold that I'm less of a person than the 6'7", 250-pound football player I walk by on the street. And this would also mean I'm more of a person than my 2-year-old son. This logic does not hold true outside of the womb. No one's arguing for the greater personhood of those who are taller or weigh more than other people. This logic doesn't hold true outside of the womb, so it can't hold true inside. In the words of the great philosopher, Dr. Seuss, a person's a person, no matter how small. It's a simple phrase, but it makes a really profound point that we don't factor size into personhood. The second marker that some argue against the personhood of the fetus is level development. This is Henrique's main argument that he gives. He says the unborn is not developed enough to be considered a person. But this argument has the same problem as the size argument. I'm much more developed than my 2-year-old son. So are we claiming that this makes him less of a person than me, or even negate his personhood altogether? Because of course, human development occurs in stages throughout an entire life, and those stages begin scientifically at the point of conception. So the unborn being less developed than a newborn or a 2-year-old or a 30-year-old really holds no moral relevancy for us. A third area is environment. This is the argument that because a child is in the womb, that child is not a person yet. But Schwarz says that the fact that the child is in her mother's womb is a geological fact, not a moral judgment. Because of course there are children that are born at 24 weeks and survive with the help of doctors. No one questions the right to live of a 25-week-old baby that was born at 24 weeks. But many would allow that same baby to be aborted 1 week later if it still resided in its mother's womb. So it's very clear that environment does not logically hold any moral weight when determining personhood. The last area that Schwarz gives is this idea of degree of dependency. And this might be the most popular argument against the personhood of the fetus. And we'll see in a minute here that this argument is even used beyond personhood. This argument is used when personhood is accepted. And this may be where the popular phrase of the pro-abortion group comes from that says, "My body, my choice. It's my body, I get to do what I want with it." Now, science makes it very clear that the fetus is not, in fact, the body of the mother. It's a separate being with different DNA, its own organs. But I don't think that that idea is at the root of this catchphrase that's often used. At the root of this is, if I don't want a baby dependent on my body, then I have the right to expel that child from my body. So while this is a real dependency, certainly a baby is dependent on the mother. I think this dependency really has no moral weight. A few examples that I think help think through this. A newborn would almost universally be considered to be a human person. There's not many that deny the personhood of a newborn baby that they're holding in their hands. But that newborn is also a dependent person. If left to herself, that newborn could not find food, could not find shelter to survive. That newborn would die without the help of someone else. Another example on the opposite spectrum of life is someone maybe in a nursing home who is suffering from some sort of ailment and cannot meet their own basic needs. Is that person now considered not a person because of their new degree of dependency? I think these examples make it clear that the degree of dependency or a change in that degree of dependency is not a measure of value or personhood. So we've looked at arguments for the personhood of the unborn. And you might assume that once this premise is accepted, if we can just accept that the fetus is a human person worthy of protection, then the debate's over. If this is accepted, we can just abolish abortion. We're done. Baby's a human person. However, there are many who will accept the personhood of the unborn is an undeniable fact, but that killing that unborn human is still permissible because the mother's bodily autonomy is superior. And there's a famous illustration that's been used many times to make this case. So I want to take a look at this illustration and talk through it and talk through why it might not be a logical way to think about the rights of the unborn. This argument comes from the early 1970s where Judith Thompson presented this case of a world-famous violinist. So I'm going to summarize this illustration for us briefly, and then we'll talk through it. So Thompson says, imagine that you woke up back to back with a world-famous violinist. You look and there's some sort of medical tubing coming out of your body, and it's going into the body of this violinist. You come to, you look, there's the doctor, and you're saying, hey, what's going on? What's happening here? And the doctor looks at you and says, hey, sorry, you were kidnapped overnight, and against your will, you were hooked up to this world-famous violinist. The Society of Music Lovers kidnapped you because the best violinist in the world had a kidney ailment, and they found out somehow that you have the perfect blood type to keep this violinist alive. So they kidnapped you, hooked you up against your will, and here you are. It's a crappy situation, but we're here, and if you pull those tubes out, you're gonna kill that violinist. Now, the argument that this illustration is meant to say is you are not morally obligated to keep that violinist alive. That violinist holds no moral obligation against you, especially since this was something that was conducted against your will or against what you intended to happen. Now, there are very important moral implications from this argument, and I want to point out a few. I think the first that is glaringly obvious is involving the biological process of sex and how our culture views sex. Notice in this illustration that pregnancy is equated with someone being kidnapped and forcibly hooked up to medical equipment. I would argue that pregnancy is much different. Pregnancy is a possible biological result, maybe an intended biological result at some point of engaging in sex with someone else. Now, I realize that some women are tragically become pregnant through rape, and I would obviously never argue that that is the same as a consensual pregnancy. But for the sake of time and for the sake of this argument, and given that rape cases make up about 1% of abortions performed, I'm not going to address that issue right now. I think there is a argument to be had there, but for the sake of time, we'll move on from that. Well, this argument at its core, it has the influence of a society that views sex as merely for personal pleasure and ignores the biological fact that a function of sex is the production of human life. Now, I'm not arguing against sexual pleasure as a bad thing, but I'm arguing that when someone has sex, pregnancy is almost always a possible outcome, even with birth control methods used. It is a possible outcome of sex. But our culture has seen pregnancy as a negative byproduct of sex and wishes to continue having sex without the burden of a baby. Nancy Pearcey, in her book, Love Thy Body, says it like this. She says, babies have become the enemy. And just as in warfare, societies tend to dehumanize the enemy in order to justify killing them. My second contention with this argument is that if the unborn is a person, but not as much as the mother, then this illustration can be logically used as justification for infanticide. Why would the mother not have the right to end the life of her 6-month-old if at that point she decided that the burden on her is too great? If the unborn is a unwanted burden, then certainly that same mother can decide that, well, the 6-month-old is now an unwanted burden, drawing on my resources, drawing on my time, drawing on my attention. And finally, the last objection is one that Francis Beckwith lays out in his book, Defending Life. Beckwith concedes, yes, the unborn is a burden on the mother. No one's acknowledging that. No one's denying that burden that pregnancy is. It's not life as normal. It's certainly difficult and a change in life. But this argument doesn't square with the notion that most people in our society accept. This notion that in ordinary circumstances, a born child has a natural moral claim upon her parents to care for her, regardless of whether she was wanted or intended to come to life or not. Now, in the violinist argument, we see a person who is artificially attached to another for survival. But the unborn child, by nature, is dependent on the mother for survival and development. And we acknowledge this in our child protection laws that we have in place that hold parents accountable for neglecting their children. And if it is acknowledged that the unborn is a human person, why would we treat that human in the womb any differently than we would treat an infant? So there's much more to be said on abortion, many more discussions to be had, but we cannot approach this issue with empty catchphrases as we often do. Francis Beckwith, once again in his book Defending Life, presents a response to the abortion argument, the argument that says, hey, don't like abortion, don't have one. If you don't like it, no one's forcing you to have an abortion. He says to this that this assertion, though common, reveals not only a deep understanding about the nature of the abortion debate, but also a confusion about what it means to say that something is morally wrong. So this is why the issue of abortion will always come down to this one question. Is the unborn a person that is worthy of defending? There are certainly other circumstances at stake. There are hard circumstances, unimaginable circumstances. But if the unborn is indeed a person, then 73 million of those innocent lives are being taken each year. And I would argue that a tragedy of that magnitude demands that we answer these hard questions and take action.